A young girl coughs violently before collapsing on her bedroom floor. In the 1740s, this would have been an all too familiar sight in London. But what if I told you that her fits were caused by a highly addictive substance that was being prescribed to her as a miracle cure for everything from stomach aches to heartbreak? Hi, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we are going to explore the hidden epidemic of laudanum addiction in Georgian London. Laudanum was a tincture made from opium that was widely used as a painkiller and sedative, and while it was legal and readily available, its use soon spiraled out of control. The substance was highly addictive, causing withdrawal symptoms like tremors and insomnia when the supply ran out. This led to many becoming dependent on the drug as they chased its euphoric high and tried to escape the harsh realities of life in 18th century London. Laudanum was known by many names, including Godfrey's cordial, Mrs. Dewsbury's drops, and the opiate cordial. But no matter what it was called, the end result was always the same. So why did laudanum become so popular? Well, there are a few reasons. Firstly, it was cheap and easy to make. Opium could be purchased from apothecaries all over the city, and a simple recipe allowed anyone to turn it into laudanum. Secondly, it was marketed as a safe and effective medicine. Laudanum was said to be a cure for everything from headaches to cholera, and was even given to children. Finally, it was seen as a way to escape the harsh realities of Georgian London. Life in the city was hard, and laudanum offered a temporary reprieve from the poverty, crime, and disease that plagued the streets. But who was taking laudanum and why? Well, anyone and everyone. Laudanum was not a drug that was limited to a certain class or group of people. Men and women of all ages and backgrounds were taking it, whether they were rich or poor, educated or illiterate, young or old. There was no one who was safe from its deadly grip. Laudanum was taken for a variety of reasons. Some people used it to self-medicate for physical ailments like pain or insomnia. Others turned to it to cope with emotional problems like grief or depression. And still others took it simply because it was available and affordable. So how did laudanum affect people's lives? Well, that depended on their social standing. For the wealthy, laudanum addiction often went unnoticed or was blamed on other factors such as stress or depression. Doctors were reluctant to diagnose their patients with addiction, and families often tried to hide the extent of their loved ones' laudanum use. On the other hand, for the poor, laudanum addiction was more likely to be noticed and commented upon. Their symptoms were often more extreme and more visible, and there was less of a stigma surrounding addiction in the lower classes. However, this did not mean that they received any real help or treatment, as most doctors were still in the dark about the true nature of laudanum addiction. Let me introduce you to our characters. Thomas sits in his opulent study writing letters, while his wife Mary rushes around the house getting ready for guests. Thomas is a successful merchant, and he has built his fortune trading in exotic goods from far-off lands. He is a member of the upper class, and his status affords him many luxuries that the average person can only dream of. But beneath the surface, Thomas is struggling with a secret addiction to laudanum. He is taking the drug to help him cope with the stress of his business dealings and to help him forget about his failing marriage. Mary, on the other hand, is trying to keep up the appearance of a happy and prosperous household. She is desperate to hide the fact that her husband is addicted to laudanum, as she fears that it will ruin her reputation in society. She works hard to make sure that their home looks perfect for their guests and that their servants are well taken care of. But beneath the surface, she is worried about the future of her family. She knows that her husband's addiction is getting worse, and she is afraid that it will eventually destroy them. Meanwhile, outside the grand house, we see a different side of life in Georgian London. In the slums, Margaret, a young mother, is trying to take care of her family while living in poverty. She is taking laudanum to help her cope with the pain of childbirth and the stress of raising children in such harsh conditions. Her sister, Elizabeth, is also addicted to the drug and is constantly trying to get more of it. Elizabeth is a beggar, and she uses laudanum to help her deal with the harsh treatment she receives from the public. Both women are struggling to survive in the slums of London, and they are turning to laudanum as a way to cope with the pain and hardship of their lives. As the story unfolds, we begin to see the effects of laudanum addiction on these two families. Thomas's addiction gets worse, and he becomes more and more isolated from his wife and friends. His business dealings suffer, and he begins to lose his fortune. Mary, on the other hand, is forced to confront her husband's addiction head-on when his behavior becomes increasingly erratic and dangerous. She is torn between her love for Thomas and her fear of his addiction, and she must make a decision about what to do next. In the slums, Margaret's addiction gets worse, and she becomes more and more neglectful of her children. Her sister, Elizabeth, continues to beg and steal in order to get more laudanum, and she is eventually caught and sent to prison. As the story reaches its climax, we see the devastating effects of laudanum addiction on these two families. Thomas's addiction destroys his life and his fortune, and Mary is left to pick up the pieces. Margaret's children are taken away from her, and she is left alone in the slums. Throughout the story, we have seen the effects of laudanum addiction on these two families. But what really happened to those who became addicted to the drug in Georgian London? Well, the answer is not a happy one. For most, laudanum addiction meant a slow and painful decline into poverty, illness, and despair. The drug's euphoric high was often followed by a crash that left users feeling weak, nauseous, and desperate for more. As their addiction grew, so did their need for laudanum, and they would soon find themselves spending all of their time and money on the drug. This often led to financial ruin, as addicts sold their possessions and took on debt to get their next fix. For some, laudanum addiction had even more devastating consequences. The drug was known to cause hallucinations, paranoia, and violent behavior, and many addicts found themselves in prison or in the workhouse, accused of crimes they did not commit or unable to work and provide for themselves. Laudanum addiction was a lonely and isolating experience. Those who were addicted to the drug often kept it secret, ashamed of their growing dependence on the substance. This only made the problem worse, as addicts became more and more isolated and cut off from the people who could have helped them. And what role did society play in the lives of these addicts? Sadly, not much of a positive one. In the 18th century, there was still a lot of stigma surrounding addiction, and those who were addicted to laudanum were often seen as weak, immoral, or even criminal. This made it even harder for them to seek help, as they were afraid of being judged or punished. Society's lack of understanding and compassion only added to the suffering of those who were already struggling to cope with the effects of laudanum addiction. As we come to the end of our exploration of laudanum addiction in Georgian London, we are left with a sense of sadness and despair. The story of Thomas and Mary, as well as the countless others who were addicted to laudanum in the 18th century, is a reminder of the devastating impact that addiction can have on individuals, families, and society as a whole. Laudanum may have been marketed as a miracle medicine, but in reality it was a poison that destroyed lives and left many families in tatters. The silence and stigma surrounding laudanum addiction in Georgian London meant that many suffered in isolation, their cries for help falling on deaf ears. It was only when they were at their lowest point that they realized the true cost of their addiction and the damage it had done to their lives. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new about laudanum addiction in Georgian London. If you want to learn more about this topic, I have included several resources in the description box below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.